fall of 2021. News of this GPT-3 software from a little company called a little hybrid nonprofit for profit called OpenAI comes out, and you couldn't really get access to it was hard to get access to GPT. This is like September of 2021. But I had heard about how they had developed this complicated organizational structure where they were half nonprofit, half for profit. And ironically, I thought at the time, I was like, well, people have already written about GPT-3 and the language models and stuff like that, but I don't think people have written about this interesting new hybrid model. And so I went to hybrid organizational structure. And so I went to the Times Magazine and I said, hey, I want to write a piece about OpenAI. I'm not so much about the language models, but about how they're structuring this organization. And they were like, oh, that sounds interesting. That turned out to be a very important part of OpenAI's history that exploded, 2 years later in the whole conflict with Sam Altman leaving and being fired and coming back. But it meant that I got access to GPT-3 as I was reporting that story. And so there was a night in like early October where I was like, well, I better try this thing out while I'm, getting ready to talk to these people about the organizational structure. And I sat down with it and spent 3 hours, and it was probably the most important transformative moment in my history with technology in my life. I mean, certainly up there with seeing HyperCard and seeing the web. Those are the three. And I just had no idea how insane it was that you could really have a not even really a conversation, but you could write a paragraph or instructions and it would continue the paragraph and write mini essays, and it seemed to know things about the world. But just the mastery of language was so overwhelming. And I just suddenly, again, I was like, oh, all the things I've always wanted, like if you could attach this to your reading history and to everything else, like you could finally build the thing that I've always wanted. And so I ended up going back to the Times Magazine and saying, I'm going to mention the organizational structure stuff, but I'm just going to write about like, what does it mean that computers have mastered language? Like what is going to be now possible? Forget AGI, forget superintelligence, which is what everybody was talking about. I was just like, just being able to like chat in conversation with a piece of software unlocks all these new things that were not possible before. And we're going to spend the next 10 years just thinking about what that means and what we can build with that. So I wrote this 10,000 word piece, which came out in April. So this is 6 months before ChatGPT came out. And it was hugely controversial. Like one of the most controversial things I've ever written in my life. I enjoyed 0 minutes of the wake of that piece coming out, because everybody was like, oh, Stephen Johnson has fallen for the hype and he doesn't realize that this is just autocomplete on steroids and it's a stochastic parrot, and wow, he's so naive. And it was just, I'm just very conflict averse anyway, so I'm like, that part of my career is the thing that I enjoy the least, so it was very unpleasant. But I think other folks read that piece and said, oh, there's something interesting here, so I'm glad I wrote it. And at that point, Google, there were a group of folks inside of Google who had spun up a new division called Google Labs. And there had been a Google Labs in the past, and this was a kind of new iteration of it. And there were two things going on at Google Labs that were relevant to this. One was it was an idea of, it was going to be a space inside of Google where you could do product-focused experiments with emerging technologies. And so it wasn't just abstract research, and it wasn't one of the existing product categories. And you could do these experiments that could be messier and that could explore the possibilities of new technologies. But they were supposed to have, as part of their mission, like, we're going to try and make something useful that people would want to actually integrate in their lives. And they had this idea of co-creation, that they wanted to, if they were going to make a music-related tool, they'd bring a musician in on day one, and then he would be or she would be there in the room making the product with them. And Clay Bavor, who was running Labs at that point, and Josh Woodward, who now runs Labs, had read Where Good Ideas Come From. Where Good Ideas Come From had influenced some of the design of Labs. And they read my piece, and they were reading my Substack about tools for thought, and they read this piece in the Times Magazine. And apparently, like, I don't know, Josh came into Clay one day and was like, what if we could get Stephen to come and like be the like first co-creator? And, because he's obsessed with these tools for thought. And so I got a cold email from Clay, who was like, longtime reader, first time caller. And can I talk to you? And I ended up going and doing this meeting with him on using their Project Starline technology, which is this like hologram that is amazing. They've now since made public, but you sit in front of like a screen and a without glasses on, and a 3D like fully realistic person like is sitting in front of you. So I went into that meeting, and like it was the only meeting in my life where the first words out of my mouth were "Holy shit!" Like this hologram appears, and so we have this incredible conversation. And at the end of it, Clay is like, "Look, man, you could just advise us, and come in every couple of months and give us an inspirational speech and feedback. But like, we think we can actually build this thing you've been chasing like your entire adult life with these language models. And we have a small team here that is kind of already starting to think about it. Why don't you just come part-time, like 50% of your time, and come and just be in the room with us and help us build it?" And I was like, I would like to do that. That sounds great. And so honestly, I thought at the time that it would we'd build a prototype, because there was a team kind of out. There was like 3 engineers allocated to it and a designer. But I thought, Google probably has a million of these things, and we'll build some prototypes. I'll meet some interesting people. It'll be a great adventure, and that'll be it. But I think because from the very beginning, we started in July of 2022, and we. So again, before the ChatGPT moment. And so we were trying to build, the first thing we were trying to do is take the language model and ground it in documents, and not just have an open-ended chat, but say, this is the source of truth. And the very first experiment we did, it was the project that preceded it was called Talk to a Small Corpus. I could take a small corpus of material and talk to it. There was a brilliant engineer named Adam Bignell who had started that project. And so Adam and I, we loaded up my book Wonderland into this thing, and I had like in a collab, like there was no UI. I was like totally, so wonky. I had to learn all these things I didn't know how to do. But I could ask, like, what does Johnson say about the history of like musical instruments? And I would get this very rudimentary little answer, but it was like grounded in the original book. And that was like late August of 2022. And so then we kind of spun up a little prototype, and Sundar saw it I think in November or something like that, and was like, whoa, my mind is whirring with the possibilities. And so we were able to, like, all through it, it was a bit like HyperCard for a while, in the sense that like the underlying model just wasn't good enough to do the things we really wanted to do. But we just started building the UI, which was as much of it as the model. Like, what does the surface look like? How do you manage potentially, hundreds of documents that you might want on a given project? And how do you get past just a chat interface and all the things that we've been doing recently? We're like, the underlying AI will catch up to our ambitions here. Let's just like charge ahead and make a slightly broken product, and it will get smarter and smarter. And so that's kind of what we did. And it really wasn't until we switched over to Gemini Pro 1.5 in May and June. So now what you basically can do with NotebookLM is you create a new notebook, which is in a sense kind of like a commonplace book for a given project. And you can upload, up to 50 documents. It can be up to 25 million words of information in a single notebook, which is just so mind-blowing to me. And it can be, PDFs, and they can have images, it's becoming increasingly multimodal. And once you've done that, effectively, it's not training the model. And so we're not, taking your information and putting it in the model that other people could use it. It's all secure and private. But effectively what it is you get a kind of personalized AI that is an expert in all the things that matter to you, and your reading history and all these things. So I've taken that 8,000 quotation collection that I've been curating since 1999.
Wow.
And I have it in a single notebook, all those quotes. And I've been slowly adding all of my books into that notebook. So I have about 6 of the books in there. And so I just haven't had time to fully build it out. But basically that notebook is going to soon enough have all the important ideas that I've ever read and all the important things that I've ever written, that I've ever published.